Let's discuss this and more with MS Now contributor Inzamam Rashid in Dubai, New York Times chief White House correspondent and MS Now contributor Peter Baker. Also with us, Josh Lederman, fellow at Princeton Center for International Security Studies, and retired Marine Colonel Mark Cancian. Inzamam, starting there in the region, where do things stand on this ceasefire right now? Have the attacks stopped, and are any ships making it through the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, it's day 2 now of this ceasefire, and we really are seeing the fragility of it, Anna, because the attacks have very much continued, particularly from Israel into Lebanon. And yes, that is a bigger question, whether Lebanon was actually included in this ceasefire. We'll come on to that in a second. But then the ships aren't really moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Yesterday, only 3 or 4 ships were accounted for that passed through, and they were mainly Iranian-linked vessels. Today, we haven't seen much movement either. And of course, now we are seeing a slinging match of words between the US and Iran. And in the middle of it, it seems right now, it is Lebanon that is suffering as a result. I think one point of positivity is that here in the Gulf, we haven't yet received any Iranian missiles or drones throughout the day today. In fact, today, the UAE hasn't recorded any whatsoever, which would suggest that Iran is complying with that side of the ceasefire up until now. But let's see what Iran's been saying about Lebanon. Well, specifically, the Iranian president, Pezeshkian, has said that the Israeli strikes on Lebanon violate the ceasefire agreement and would render negotiations meaningless. He also added that Iran would not abandon the Lebanese people. And this is because yesterday we saw a huge Israeli onslaught inside of Lebanon, where more than 250 people were killed, more than 1,100 people had been injured, women, children, everyday people of Lebanon. And so this has now put a huge question mark over the whole idea of this ceasefire, because Iran turned around and said, well, if you carry on, we'll keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. And I think that's why going into this weekend and these negotiations led by the vice president in Pakistan with the Iranians, it's likely that Lebanon's going to be on the top of the agenda.
Inzamam Rashid, thank you so much for that reporting, for laying out the state of play right now in the Middle East. Peter, what more do we know about the delegations taking part in these talks on Saturday and why Secretary Rubio isn't part of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? The president has given this assignment to his vice president, the same vice president who seems to be the only voice in the room that had questioned the value of going to war in the first place. So this is a very interesting position for the vice president to be in, right? As our reporting has showed, my colleagues Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan have a new excerpt out from their forthcoming book, Inside the Room, Inside the Situation Room, in the days leading up to the beginning of this operation. And it's clear from that reporting that J.D. Vance is really the only one who said, wait a second, is this the right thing we want to do? Now, once the president made the decision, of course, the vice president said, I'm on your side. I will support you, and you should do it as overwhelmingly as possible to get it over as quickly as possible. But he's also been the one who has voiced more realism in the day or so since this ceasefire was taking hold. He's called it a fragile truce. He has not called it overwhelming victory in the same way that you hear out of the White House podium here in Washington as he's traveling. He will be on the hook to see if he can turn desire into reality.
And I want to talk more about the vice president's role a little bit later. But Josh, continuing to tick through some of the developments that have happened in just the last 24 hours or so, the Strait of Hormuz apparently isn't back open. And there's open debate over whether Lebanon and Hezbollah were part of the ceasefire. We have the U.S. and Iran saying 2 different things about nuclear enrichment. It almost sounds like these 2 countries agreed to 2 totally different frameworks. What do you think is going on?
Yeah, that really bodes well, if not for the possibility of this ceasefire holding up, but for the likelihood that it could collapse and that these negotiations that the Pakistanis are trying to broker could not really amount to anything. Because in order to sit down with your enemy and kind of agree to a longer term, more permanent ceasefire and end to the war, you have to be operating from a basic set of agreed facts, right? And the fact that the president was talking about about the Iranian proposal being a good basis for discussion. And then we learned that not only do they not agree on some of these basic principles, but that the Iranians' version includes some real maximalist claims about their future control of the strait, things as intense as the U.S. withdrawing all its combat forces from the Middle East, which is clearly something that's not going to happen. And it's difficult to see a zone of possible agreement for these two countries that would allow both sides to be able to go back to their own domestic publics and say that they ended this war on terms that are favorable to them.
But Josh, why is Israel still escalating their fight in Lebanon in this moment, potentially jeopardizing the ceasefire? Why not hit pause and let the talks happen?
Well, most likely because the Israelis don't really want to see a fast end to this war, certainly not under the kinds of terms that President Trump seems like he may have agreed to. The Israelis want to finish the job, for lack of a better word, in terms of the Iranian regime. They, according to a lot of the reporting, have been pushing the Trump administration to keep going. We've obviously seen Israel far more willing to attack energy infrastructure in Iran, something that the U.S. does not think is a super wise idea, either for the viability of the energy markets or for the prospects of ending the war. And so it may be that the Israelis, in a way, are playing a spoiler and trying to undermine the likelihood that this ceasefire will hold long enough for this to end in a conclusion of the war prior to them concluding what they feel are their core military objectives.
Colonel, the vice president of the European Commission says the U.S.-Iran truce should include Lebanon, and she adds, quote, Israel's right to defend itself does not justify inflicting such massive destruction. Israeli strikes killed hundreds last night, we know, making it hard to argue that such heavy-handed actions fall within self-defense. They face similar criticisms over the war in Gaza, of course. Has Israel gone beyond self-defense in Lebanon?
The Israelis have been threatened by Hezbollah for a long time. You have to keep in mind that when the war began, the northern border was quiet. Hezbollah was not participating. They were keeping their heads down. They wanted to stay out of the war. Iran pushed them into the war as a way of relieving pressure on Iran. And because Hezbollah is one of their clients, Hezbollah didn't have much choice. So they started launching rockets. And then the Israelis retaliated. And then we are where we are today. That does perhaps give some hope that the Iranians might be able to make a deal here, pull back Hezbollah in a way that might satisfy Israel, and then Israel stops its attacks.
A senior administration official confirms to MS Now that Iran's supreme leader privately instructed negotiators to move towards a deal on Monday, and that kind of helped jar the attacks loose in terms of like holding off the fighting. Peter, how does the White House, do you think, interpret that move that the supreme leader is now kind of putting his stamp on this? And what could it say about how they expect things to go on Saturday?
Well, look, you've heard the president say that the new regime, as he calls it, which is not really a new regime as so much as a new leader who happens to be the son of the old leader, is more reasonable than the old regime. Now, that's a real assessment that needs to be tested here. By all accounts, the son of Khamenei, who was killed, the original Ayatollah Khamenei, is even more radical than his father and clearly has reason to feel certainly aggrieved by, this war, which killed his father, his wife, his other relatives of his family, and so forth. But it is conceivable, of course, that he wants an end to this war, and I think the president would take any sign like that as a indication that Iran is ready to back down. Now, the maximalist demands that Iran has floated, that's a negotiation. We'll see how insistent they are on those specific conditions. Obviously, many of those are things the United States presumably can't live with. Certainly doesn't sound like unconditional surrender, which is what the president originally said he was insisting on. But all of this will be hashed out, in these next days and weeks, and we'll see that the patience for resuming war, the tolerance for resuming war, if for some reason a full-on deal is not reached, is pretty low right now. And I think that, there's a desire to get this over with.
And there's just been so much mixed messaging from this administration on just a lack of clarity about why the U.S. started this war, what the end game looks like. Colonel, in the latest post from the president overnight, he confirmed the U.S. military assets will remain in the region as these talks play out. And he finished with this. In the meantime, our great military is loading up and resting, looking forward, actually, to its next conquest. So first he threatens to destroy a whole civilization. Now he's talking conquest. What message does this send to military leaders about what he may ask of them down the line?
Well, my interpretation of that was that the military forces in the region are resting, they're doing maintenance, they're getting ready for a next round if necessary. The question of what conquest means, unclear. Of course, the president is much given to exaggeration. What's important is what's actually passed in terms of guidance and instructions to the military. That has to come with the advice of the chairman. And I think we'll hear about what that looks like, but I suspect that it's going to look, if we do resume, much like what we've seen up until now.